I got the idea for this nervous character, and I wrote a monologue. And a friend of mine knew the owner of a club.
Don Knotts spent most of his life making people laugh. But behind a nervous smile and funny voice was a man carrying deep pain from childhood all the way to old age. Millions of television fans knew him as the lovable and awkward Deputy Barney Fife from The Andy Griffith Show, yet very few people understood how difficult his real life had been. Long before fame found him, Don grew up in a home filled with fear, poverty, and emotional stress. Those early experiences shaped the person he later became on screen. His comedy style did not come from confidence or comfort. It came from anxiety, loneliness, and the need to survive emotionally. Even after becoming one of the most recognized television stars in America, Don continued battling personal struggles that stayed hidden from the public. His marriages faced problems. His health slowly declined, and many of his biggest career decisions left him disappointed. In the final years of his life, he dealt with illness, weakness, and growing sadness while depending heavily on the woman who stayed beside him until the end. When he died in 2006, many fans focused on the money left behind and the inheritance given to his third wife, Frances Yarborough. Some people believe his children deserved more, while others defended the woman who cared for him during his final years. But the true story was much more emotional than a simple argument over money. It was a story of a man who spent his entire life searching for peace, acceptance, and love while hiding his pain behind comedy. The ending of Don Knotts and his wife became especially heartbreaking because it showed how fragile and lonely fame can really be once the cameras stop rolling. Don Knotts was born Jesse Donald Knotts on July 21st, 1924, in Morgantown, West Virginia. By the time he entered the world, his family was already struggling badly. His parents had recently lost their farm, and money problems were becoming impossible to ignore. His mother, Elsie, was exhausted from trying to support the family, while his father, William Jesse Knotts, suffered from severe mental health problems that terrified everyone inside the home. Don later learned that his father had experienced a serious mental breakdown years before he was born. Instead of being a calm and caring parent, his father often became unpredictable and frightening. He spent much of his time lying on a couch inside the house, but his quiet appearance could suddenly turn into screaming, threats, or violent behavior. As a child, Don learned to move carefully around him to avoid setting him off. One of the most shocking stories from Don's early life involved an incident his mother revealed years later. When Don was still a baby, his father reportedly held a knife to his throat during one of his episodes. Don had no memory of the moment because he was too young, but hearing about it later deeply affected him. Suddenly, many of his fears and insecurities made more sense. The family home itself was crowded and stressful because Elsie turned it into a boarding house to earn money. Strangers constantly came and went, leaving little privacy or comfort for children. Don even slept on a small cot near the kitchen stove instead of having a real bedroom. These experiences made him feel small and invisible, but they also pushed him toward imagination and performance. To escape fear and sadness, he created funny voices and imaginary scenes in his mind. Without realizing it, the nervous energy that later made audiences laugh was already beginning to form during these painful childhood years. Life inside the Knotts household became even harder as Don grew older. His older brothers were dealing with their own frustrations and problems, and the home rarely felt peaceful or safe. Money was always short, and every family member seemed to carry emotional stress in different ways. Despite the chaos, Don paid close attention to humor, because it was one of the few things that could briefly lighten the mood. One of his brothers had a sharp sense of comedy, and Don noticed how laughter could temporarily break tension inside the house. That idea stayed with him for the rest of his life. Another brother, William Earl, known by the nickname Shadow because of how thin he was, became someone Don quietly admired. Sadly, tragedy struck again in 1941 when Shadow suddenly died during an asthma attack. Don was only 17 years old and watched helplessly as one of the few people he felt connected to disappeared forever. The loss left a deep emotional scar. Around the same time, Don became increasingly interested in performing. As a young boy, he received a ventriloquist dummy named Danny, and it quickly became his closest companion. Through the dummy, Don discovered he could entertain people and make them laugh. He performed at school events, church gatherings, and small local shows, slowly building confidence while hiding behind the puppet's voice. Performing gave him something his childhood rarely provided: attention without fear. Then another major change happened when his father died of pneumonia in 1937. Even though losing a parent is usually painful, Don later admitted that his father's death also brought relief because the fear inside the home finally eased. For the first time, he could breathe more freely and begin opening up socially. In high school, he became active in school activities, wrote for the yearbook, and even served as class president. Yet beneath the growing confidence, the insecurities from childhood never fully disappeared. After graduating from high school in 1942, Don decided to chase his dream of becoming an entertainer. Carrying little money but plenty of hope, he traveled to New York City believing talent and hard work would eventually open doors for him. Reality turned out to be far more painful. Auditions ended in rejection after rejection, and one casting director even told him he should completely give up on entertainment because he would never succeed. Those harsh words stayed in Don's mind for years. With no money and no opportunities left, he returned home feeling defeated and embarrassed. Back in West Virginia, he took a job plucking chickens at a grocery market. The work was dirty, exhausting, and far from the glamorous future he had imagined. Still, he refused to fully abandon his dream. In 1943, during World War II, Don joined the United States Army. Because of his small size and nervous personality, he was not sent into direct combat. Instead, he became part of a special entertainment unit that performed comedy routines for soldiers stationed across the Pacific. This experience changed his life. Traveling with his ventriloquist dummy, Don entertained homesick soldiers and discovered that people genuinely found him funny. One night after a performance, another comedian told him he was naturally gifted and did not even need the dummy to succeed. That simple comment became a turning point. Eventually, Don made a dramatic decision and threw the dummy into the ocean during a ship voyage. Symbolically, he was letting go of the object that had helped him survive childhood and beginning to trust his own personality. After the war ended, Don attended college and studied speech and education while continuing to perform. In 1947, he married Catherine Metz, beginning the first of 3 marriages that would shape different stages of his complicated personal life. By 1948, he was once again heading to New York, still determined to make his dream come true despite years of rejection and disappointment. Don Knotts slowly began building a career through radio, television appearances, and comedy performances before finally reaching national fame in the 1960s. His biggest breakthrough came when he joined the Andy Griffith Show and created the unforgettable character of Deputy Barney Fife. Barney was nervous, awkward, overly confident, and constantly anxious, yet audiences loved him because he felt strangely real and human. What many viewers never realized was how much of Don's own personality and emotional history existed inside that character. The fear, insecurity, and nervous energy that made Barney funny were connected to emotions Don had carried since childhood. His performance became one of the most memorable roles in television history. Between 1961 and 1967, Don won 5 Emmy Awards for his work on the series, proving how deeply audiences connected with him. At the height of the show's popularity, he appeared untouchable. Critics praised him, fans adored him. His future seemed brighter than ever before. But one career decision changed everything. Don believed the Andy Griffith Show would end after 5 seasons because that was his understanding from conversations with Andy Griffith. Wanting to avoid missing his chance at movie stardom, he signed a film contract with Universal Pictures in 1965. Unfortunately, Andy Griffith later decided to continue the show longer than expected. By then, Don had already signed his contract and officially left the series. Although he returned for occasional guest appearances, the close friendship between the 2 stars never fully recovered. Don later admitted he feared being trapped forever in one role if he stayed too long in Mayberry. Sadly, his attempt to become a major movie star never reached the level he hoped for. His films, including The Ghost and Mr. Chicken and The Reluctant Astronaut, gained loyal fans and earned money, but critics often dismissed them as lightweight comedies. Over time, Don realized escaping the shadow of Barney Fife would be much harder than he expected. As the years passed, Don Knotts continued working steadily, but the pressure of fame and career expectations slowly took an emotional toll on him. Universal Pictures hoped to turn him into a major comedy film star similar to Jerry Lewis. Yet many of his movies performed only moderately at the box office. Some became cult favorites later, but during their original release, critics often treated them harshly. One of the biggest failures came with The Love God in 1969. In the film, Don played a shy bird watcher who accidentally becomes involved with a men's magazine company. The movie attempted to place him inside a more adult and edgy comedy style popular during the late 1960s. Unfortunately, audiences struggled to accept Don in such a different role. Fans wanted the lovable, nervous Barney Fife personality, not sexual comedy material. The movie performed poorly, and many theaters refused to show it at all. Instead of helping Don break free from TYP, Don Knotts became one of the most loved comedy stars in American television history. But the real story behind his life was far more painful than most fans ever imagined. Millions of people knew him as the nervous and funny Deputy Barney Fife from the Andy Griffith Show. Yet behind that famous smile was a man shaped by fear, poverty, loss, and deep emotional scars that followed him for decades. Don was born as Don Knotts on July 21st, 1924, in Morgantown. His family was already struggling badly before he even entered the world. Just 1 month before his birth, the family lost their farm, which pushed him into financial disaster. His mother, Elsie, was exhausted from trying to hold the family together, while his father, William Jesse Knotts, suffered from severe mental illness after a breakdown years earlier. Their small house became a boarding home filled with strangers because renting rooms was the only way the family could survive. Don did not even have a proper bedroom and often slept on a small cot in the kitchen. The home was noisy, tense, and filled with fear. His father could become violent without warning, and young Don learned to move quietly around the house to avoid setting him off. The worst moment came when Don later discovered that his father had once held a knife to his throat during one of his episodes when Don was still a baby. He only learned this horrifying truth when he was around 30 years old, and suddenly many of his fears and insecurities began to make sense. Instead of becoming angry or violent himself, Don escaped inward. He created imaginary worlds, acted out little scenes, and discovered that making people laugh could briefly remove fear from his life. What later became his famous nervous comedy style was not just acting. It was something built from years of anxiety, loneliness, and emotional survival during a deeply troubled childhood. As Don grew older, life did not become much easier. His family remained poor, and his mother worked endlessly sewing clothes, washing laundry, and baking whatever she could sell just to keep food on the table. His older brothers struggled with anger and drinking, and Don often felt weak and invisible beside them. Yet even during those hard years, he noticed the power humor had over people. One brother in particular could make others laugh during terrible moments, and Don quietly held on to that idea. Laughter seemed to make pain disappear, even if only for a few minutes. Another brother named William Earl, known in the family as Shadow because of how thin he was, became someone Don truly admired. But tragedy struck again in 1941, when Shadow suddenly died from an asthma attack right in front of the family. Don was only 17 years old, and the loss crushed him emotionally. Around that same period, Don found comfort in performing. As a young boy, he received a ventriloquist dummy named Danny, and that simple toy changed his life. With Danny, Don could create conversations, characters, and little stories that made him feel less alone. He began performing at schools, churches, and local events, where people laughed and paid attention to him for the first time. Those moments gave him confidence he had never felt before. Then another major change happened when his father died of pneumonia in 1937. Although it was painful, the fear that had filled the house for years finally lifted. Don slowly became more social and active in school. By high school, he wrote for the yearbook, performed in comedy skits, and even became class president. From the outside, he looked successful and confident, but inside he still felt weak, awkward, and insecure about his thin body and nervous personality. After graduating in 1942, he traveled to New York City with only $100, hoping to become an entertainer. Instead, he faced rejection after rejection. One casting director cruelly told him he would never succeed in show business. Broke and discouraged, Don returned home and worked in a grocery store plucking chickens. standing for hours surrounded by feathers, blood, and exhaustion. Yet even during those humiliating moments, he refused to completely give up on the dream of becoming a performer. In 1943, Don joined the United States Army during World War II, and unexpectedly, that decision became one of the biggest turning points in his life. Because he was small and physically weak, he was not sent into heavy combat duty. Instead, he became part of a special entertainment unit that traveled across the Pacific performing comedy shows for soldiers. Don brought his ventriloquist dummy Danny with him and continued entertaining crowds, making tired and homesick soldiers laugh during one of the darkest periods in world history. For the first time, experienced performers began noticing his talent. One comedian told him directly that he was genuinely funny and had real ability. Those simple words meant everything to a man who had spent most of his life doubting himself. During one performance, someone shouted that Don was actually funnier without the dummy than with it. That comment stayed in his mind. Eventually, while traveling on a ship, Don made a symbolic decision that shocked even him. He threw Danny into the ocean, letting go of the object that had protected him emotionally since childhood. It marked the moment he truly stepped forward as his own performer. After the war ended in 1946, Don returned home and attended college, studying speech and education while continuing to perform comedy whenever possible. In 1947, he married his first wife, Catherine Metz, and a year later he returned to New York determined to succeed this time. Slowly, small opportunities began appearing. Don worked in radio, television, and comedy programs, building a reputation for his nervous but lovable style. Then came the role that changed everything forever. In 1960, Andy Griffith cast him as Deputy Barney Fife on The Andy Griffith Show. The role turned Don into a television superstar almost overnight. Barney Fife was nervous, excitable, overly confident, and constantly creating chaos, yet audiences absolutely loved him. Don's performance felt natural because much of Barney's anxiety came from emotions Don had experienced his entire life. Between 1961 and 1967, he won 5 Emmy Awards for the role, becoming one of television's most respected comedy actors. Fans saw him as untouchable, but even at the height of success, Don still carried the same fears and insecurities that had followed him since childhood. Despite the enormous success of The Andy Griffith Show, one of the biggest mistakes